When you think of skyrocketing brands like Aloe, Allbirds, or Skims, it's easy to credit their success to great products, sleek branding, and brilliant marketing. But here's the overlooked secret. The real magic lies in the engine behind the scenes, the business powering their business. For millions of brands, that engine is Shopify, making selling seamless for them and shopping effortless for us. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Aloe Yoga uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/retail, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/retail to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/retail.
Businesses that are selling through the roof, like Untuck It, make selling and for shoppers buying simple with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And with Shop Pay, you can boost conversions up to 50%. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Untuck It uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcast free, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/podcast free to upgrade your selling today.
Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Okay, so we're talking about today British decolonisation in Africa, and there's a kind of a version of things that you hear, mainly through the way the decline of the British Empire is taught in schools. The focus is normally on India. And of course, when India goes in 1947, the writing is on the wall for the rest of the British Empire. India provides much of the empire's wealth and manpower. But Africa, as a source of extracted wealth, often it kind of gets overlooked. You know, when there is, in school teaching, often we fast forward to Macmillan talking about the winds of change in the late 1950s. But the winds of change were only there because of a decade or more of post-war anti-colonial resistance. You know, the British love to think of themselves as this country that kind of orderly disassembled its empire, not like the French or the various kind of American colonial wars in places like Vietnam. No. Britain did a stellar job of quietly disassembling its empire peacefully. Well, no, it didn't. It was complete and utter fabrication. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at Britain in the Central African emergency, and Martin Thomas places Britain's and colonial 1950s in a wider context. I think this is really interesting framing, and a very valid one, and well worth just kind of clipping this one out and keeping it. He writes, "There is a case, so far as the halting strides of British decolonisation are concerned, for thinking of a short 1950s, bookended by the election victory of Winston Churchill's Conservatives in October 1951, and the appointment of the reformer Ian MacLeod as Harold Macmillan's colonial secretary in October 1959. Over the intervening 8 years, 3 successive Conservative governments courted their favourite nationalist collaborators and picked fights with others they deemed too radical. British military force and covert interventions were used with seeming abandon, not as a last resort, but as a first, to restore the Shah of Iran in 1953, to prevent left-wing victory in the Latin American colony of British Guyana the same year, and more generally, to ramp up counterinsurgency efforts in Malaya, Kenya, and Cyprus. In this sense, the attempt to overthrow Egypt's Colonel Nasser in November 1956 fitted a broader trend. Certain Conservative ministers were also willing to defend white settler privilege in southern Africa in a way that their Labour opponents found increasingly repugnant. In the case of the Central African Federation, the CAF, of Southern Rhodesia, and the protectorates of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, it is particularly difficult to untangle fight from flight. The 3 territories were federated in January 1953 in a state-building exercise, the objective of which was never wholly agreed between the participant governments. Ironically, one of the main designers was Andrew Cohen, the far-sighted colonial office mandarin, often credited with formulating schemes for the peaceful dismantling of Britain's African empire. Welded together against the wishes of its African majority populations, and against the advice of colonial governments in Lusaka and Zomba, the Federation would last a decade before crashing to destruction, leaving a tangled wreck of constitutional debris to pick through as the component territories went their separate ways. Bitterness about the Federation's demise was strong amongst the Southern Rhodesia's whites. By 1963, who were well on the road to rebellion. Yet it was their politics that made the Federation so toxic, much as the politics of the French settlers in Vietnam made any hope of compromise, any hope of a shared future in Vietnam almost impossible. During the Central African Federation's 10-year existence, meaningful reforms were withheld from black Africans, while at the same time the white settler minority, especially those in Southern Rhodesia, consistently the most intransigent nationalist constituency in Central Africa, was shamelessly placated. Southern Rhodesia contained by far the largest settler population of the 3 federated territories, close to 200,000, next to Nyasaland's 9,000, and Northern Rhodesia's 70,000. The majority of Southern Rhodesia's whites were neither wealthy farmers nor civil servants, but skilled workers. Their employment prospects and economic status were threatened by the Africanization of local industry. In Northern Rhodesia, whose all-important copper belt was dominated by three part British-owned mining conglomerates, company interest in promoting opportunities for their African labour force clashed with the preferential status once accorded to white mine workers through the industry colour bar. To be sure, post-war British governments had diminishing means to restrain settler demands, whether in the labour market or in matters of politics or cultural privilege. And again, the same was true of French white settlers, colonial settlers in Vietnam. The French government was running out of means to placate them and coming to the conclusion that they are not placatable. These were people that believed themselves to be in an existential struggle for their own existence, who believed that they were being betrayed and saw betrayal absolutely everywhere they looked, and were unwilling, due to their kind of own sense of white superiority, to acknowledge that the wheel of history was indeed turning, and that a majority non-white population, would not settle for colonial subjugation for very much longer. Colonial governors, writes Martin Thomas, wielded executive power in Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, but Southern Rhodesia had been internally self-governing since 1923. Its model of white rule, based on a narrow franchise and a firm grip on the levers of local economic power, was always liable to spread to its two neighbours once the federation took shape. Confusion persisted over the division of responsibilities between Britain, the three local territorial administrations, and the new federal authorities, even so. Defence, for example, was a federal matter. Policing remained in the hands of individual territorial governments, and the British government maintained direct interests in both. These overlapping jurisdictions would cause intense friction between all sides from 1958 onwards, as the choice between oppression or conciliation of the African majority in all three federated territories became urgent. Much clearer was that the apparatus of federal government would be settler-built and settler-led. Once established, the federation enjoyed lawmaking powers. British ministers and Whitehall officials scrutinising legislation but not initiating it.
Ya vienen los touchdowns. ¿Estás listo? Esta temporada de la NFL convierte las jugadas grandes en premios con DraftKings Sportsbook, un socio oficial de apuestas deportivas de la NFL. Descarga la app de DraftKings Sportsbook y usa el código HEART. Ese es el código HEART para recibir $200 en bonus bets al instante cuando hagas tu primera apuesta de $5. En colaboración con DraftKings, la corona es tuya. ¿Problemas con el juego? Llama al 1-800-GAMBLER. En Nueva York, llama al 877-8-HOPE-NY o envía un mensaje de texto con la palabra HOPE-NY al 467-369. En Connecticut, hay ayuda disponible para problemas con el juego. Llama al 888-789-7777 o visita ccpg.org. Juega responsablemente. En nombre de Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. Debe ser mayor de 21 años. Pueden aplicarse cargos en Illinois. La elegibilidad varía según la jurisdicción. No válido en Ontario. Las apuestas de bono son de un solo uso. La apuesta no se incluye en las ganancias y caducan después de ser otorgadas. La oferta finaliza el 29 de septiembre 2025 a las 11:59 p.m. hora del este. Los términos en DraftKings.com/sportsbook/promos.
When you think of skyrocketing brands like Aloe, Allbirds, or Skims, it's easy to credit their success to great products, sleek branding, and brilliant marketing. But here's the overlooked secret. The real magic lies in the engine behind the scenes, the business powering their business. For millions of brands, that engine is Shopify, making selling seamless for them and shopping effortless for us. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Aloe Yoga uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/retail, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/retail to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/retail.
Martin Thomas writes, the underlying tensions between the government in London and Salisbury, over the wisdom of and purpose of a territorial amalgamation were of long standing. A Central African Council set up in wartime to contain pressure for the amalgamation of the two Rhodesias was sidelined when hostilities ended. But the white-dominated governments in Salisbury and Lusaka acquired a stronger financial hold over mining company profits, internal trade, and the crucial rail network linking the three Central African territories with one another and with South Africa. Meanwhile, the danger presented by the post-war immigration of thousands of Afrikaner South Africans, perceived as even more reactionary than their Anglophone cousins in the north of the Zambezi, mounted steadily. So white South Africans were passing into the Central African Federation for jobs, opportunities, and opportunities that weren't there in South Africa for them. These are often lower middle class and working class white South Africans, believing that there was kind of colonial opportunities north. This allowed Rhodesian settler politicians like Sir Godfrey Huggins and Roy Walensky, successive leaders of the United Federal Party, to make the case for a federation as a better than solution than the creeping influence of apartheid. And this is what the Central African Federation and later Rhodesia under Ian Smith. If you're interested in this, by the way, there's a look up the interview I did with Peter Hain on South Africa and Rhodesia, South Africa, and there was another interview I did from the Guardian Southern Africa correspondent, all on Rhodesia, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there about Mugabe and Ian Smith. The former being a cold and clever and calculating the man, and the latter being a stupid oaf by all accounts. Some British ministers, backed by officials of the Commonwealth Relations Office, the CRO, which handled the Federation's administrative business, were happy to go along with this, the idea that the conditions, whatever conditions were like for black people in the Central African Federation, actually the two Rhodesias at the time, they were better than in apartheid South Africa. Negotiators on both sides colluded in making a white-dominated federation between the southern and northern Rhodesia, with Nyasaland thrown in, appear a reasonable compromise rather than an institutionalization of settled domination as it actually was. Why then did successive Conservative governments, various Whitehall departments, and the broad spectrum of British political and press opinion consider the federation scheme a good idea? The answer was that, in the eyes of the British sponsors, far from making interracial conflict more likely, the federation seemed to offer a middle way between racial authoritarianism in the South African style and the surrender of Britain's Central African interests to black nationalist regimes. The CAF supposedly offered a different gradualist route to racial harmony. The Federation's settlers were supposed eventually to share power with moderate African representatives. So there had to be African leaders who would be acceptable, moderate, who would be who would limit their demands. The CAF supposedly offered a different gradualist route to racial harmony. The Federation settlers were supposed eventually to share power with moderate African representatives. Such multiracialism, integral to the Conservative Party's approach, not only to the CAF, but to Kenyan politics as well, turned out to be a pipe dream. From the outset, Southern Rhodesian settler leaders exploited the apparatus of federal rule to weaken countervailing British authority and to thereby ensure continuing white supremacy. So the settlers did, again, what the settlers in Vietnam did. They basically tried to water down and fob off the gradualist approach towards integration and compromise, and they are deliberately trying to obstruct what London is doing.
Ya vienen los touchdowns. ¿Estás listo? Esta temporada de la NFL convierte las jugadas grandes en premios con DraftKings Sportsbook, un socio oficial de apuestas deportivas de la NFL. Descarga la app de DraftKings Sportsbook y usa el código HEART. Ese es el código HEART para recibir $200 en bonus bets al instante cuando hagas tu primera apuesta de $5. En colaboración con DraftKings, la corona es tuya. ¿Problemas con el juego? Llama al 1-800-GAMBLER. En Nueva York, llama al 877-8-HOPE-NY o envía un mensaje de texto con la palabra HOPE-NY al 467-369. En Connecticut, hay ayuda disponible para problemas con el juego. Llama al 888-789-7777 o visita ccpg.org. Juega responsablemente. En nombre de Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. Debe ser mayor de 21 años. Pueden aplicarse cargos en Illinois. La elegibilidad varía según la jurisdicción. No válido en Ontario. Las apuestas de bono son de un solo uso. La apuesta no se incluye en las ganancias y caducan después de ser otorgadas. La oferta finaliza el 29 de septiembre 2025 a las 11:59 p.m. hora del este. Los términos en DraftKings.com/sportsbook/promos.
Your business is one of a kind, so your website should be too. With Wix, it's easy. Almost too easy to create a website that's perfectly yours. Just tell AI what kind of site you want to build or choose from thousands of templates. Change whatever you want, whenever you want, and get everything you need to start running your business your way. No matter what you sell or what you aspire to be, you can do it all, yourself, on Wix. Go to Wix.com.
In the hopes that they can maintain the kind of white exclusive authoritarian white rule that they wanted. This would eventually lead them into conflict with the British government. For them, the Federation was both the prelude and the means to transform its component territories into a white-governed dominion, a Greater Rhodesia whose racial politics would approximate South African standards, not British. And that was where they were gravitating towards. So the white settlers were looking to apartheid as a model, not to the British, who were, racial egalitarians by no means, but who were looking for a gradualist compromise position where black economic, social, and political rights were expanded, but not to the necessarily entirely to the detriment of white ones. And racial supremacy is the guiding ethos of the white settlers. But the CAF's checkered history was never reducible to a two-way fight between settler reactionaries and British liberal reformers. Far from it. On one hand, African nationalist groups, including Southern Rhodesia's African National Congress, Joshua Nkomo's breakaway Zimbabwe African People's Union, and their northern cousin, the Zambia African National Congress, led by Harriet Nkombole and Kenneth Kaunda, rejected co-option on principle. Each proved their fitness to govern through quite extraordinary forbearance in the face of mounting repression. On the other hand, Western politicians, mainly on the conservative right, sympathised with settlers' fears of reverse discrimination under black majority rule. So this has been a kind of a Tory hobby horse for many decades. The idea that whatever happened in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Southern Rhodesia, and Southern Africa in general, where there are white settlers involved, that it's gone too far the other way now, and white settlers are the real victims. White farmers were unlikely to thrive under such regimes. Many produced tobacco and foodstuffs on well-run estates, employing large numbers of African labourers. Agricultural revenues were fundamental to Southern Rhodesia's prosperity. It was, the breadbasket of Southern Africa. What would happen if the land made productive by the white pioneer was no longer farmed efficiently? And here there is this racialized fantasy of the kind of the white pioneer stumbling across this empty wilderness where nobody was really doing anything beforehand, and carving out a kind of profitable agribusiness, agri-capitalism from the wilderness. And it's so stuffed with kind of racial presumptions about the kind of industriousness and ingenuity of white people, and how there's the African labor, probably in the eyes of racial colonializers, was simply doing nothing before they turned up, which is obviously kind of ludicrous. The countryside might be destabilized. The city is flooded with the unemployed. Security services and some Foreign Office personnel fretted about communist infiltration facilitated by African nationalist fellow travellers. Most of all, cabinet ministers, the CRO and the Colonial Office, the Federation, once established, acquired a status akin to an inconvenient stretch of greenbelt, worth protecting to a point, but an obstacle to the pressures of modernization. When push came to shove, it was not worth fighting over. And this is the kind of the big question during British decolonization. Is the candle worth the flame? Is it worth fighting for territory? And in most instances, the British decide on the balance of things no. And the main reason why they decide no is because the biggest fighting force that they have, the Indian Army, is no more, or it's no longer under the control of the British. Avoiding conflict in Central Africa proved impossible, however. The British did little initially to block the federal government in Salisbury from reconfiguring the CAF constitution to block democratic reform. Indeed, it fell to the protectorate governors, particularly Sir Arthur Benson in Northern Rhodesia, to warn against devolving too much authority to the federal authorities, especially in relation to policing, internal security, and the detention of political opponents. States of emergency designed to stifle African protests, such as pithead strikes and a boycott of beer halls in Northern Rhodesia's Copperbelt in 1956 to 57, were periodically enacted even so. In response, between 57 and 59, African nationalist parties in all three federation territories coalesced around three central concerns: the institutional basis of discrimination, the threat of federation independence under settler control, and the barriers to reform within the CAF, next to the gathering pace of decolonization elsewhere. In their eyes, federal rule, its agenda always set by Southern Rhodesia settlers, was the enemy. And they were right to think that, because they could see quite easily the trap that was being set for them. That federation would simply be a means of cementing white rule into something far more kind of overtly and violently racialized than anything the populations of what made up the CAF, the two Rhodesias and Nyasaland, had previously experienced. And the various nationalist figures looked to the future, and they saw basically the creation of a second South Africa, a second apartheid state. And this is what the white settlers essentially tried to build. And it's what the British governments of the 1950s and then the 1960s attempt to firstly negotiate with, then to sanction, and then to undermine, because it was contrary to Britain's overall policies towards decolonization, and there was always the danger that Britain would be drawn into conflict in Southern Africa, which British governments obviously did not want. So there you go. And I'll continue that story probably in a week or so. I'll see if I can dig out the links to the other episodes that I mentioned. If not, they're all kind of jumbled in there somewhere, so have a look. There's a ton of new things happening on the website. We're trying to really make it a useful tool for teachers and students, as well as anybody else that wants to, that is generally interested in modern history. As I said the other day, the podcast survives because of you. If you're able to become a subscriber to Patreon to support the podcast, that's great. If not, a one-off donation is always gratefully received. There's the means to do it down below. And this is how we thrive. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Ya vienen los touchdowns. ¿Estás listo? Esta temporada de la NFL convierte las jugadas grandes en premios con DraftKings Sportsbook, un socio oficial de apuestas deportivas de la NFL. Descarga la app de DraftKings Sportsbook y usa el código HEART. Ese es el código HEART para recibir $200 en bonus bets al instante cuando hagas tu primera apuesta de $5. En colaboración con DraftKings, la corona es tuya. ¿Problemas con el juego? Llama al 1-800-GAMBLER. En Nueva York, llama al 877-8-HOPE-NY o envía un mensaje de texto con la palabra HOPE-NY al 467-369. En Connecticut, hay ayuda disponible para problemas con el juego. Llama al 888-789-7777 o visita ccpg.org. Juega responsablemente. En nombre de Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. Debe ser mayor de 21 años. Pueden aplicarse cargos en Illinois. La elegibilidad varía según la jurisdicción. No válido en Ontario. Las apuestas de bonos son de un solo uso. La apuesta no se incluye en las ganancias y caducan después de ser otorgadas. La oferta finaliza el 29 de septiembre 2025 a las 11:59 p.m. hora del este. Los términos en DraftKings.com/sportsbook/promos.
When you think of skyrocketing brands like Aloe, Allbirds, or Skims, it's easy to credit their success to great products, sleek branding, and brilliant marketing. But here's the overlooked secret. The real magic lies in the engine behind the scenes, the business powering their business. For millions of brands, that engine is Shopify, making selling seamless for them and shopping effortless for us. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Aloe Yoga uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/retail, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/retail to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/retail.